Hi BookTube, welcome to a Middlemarch meditation. We're finishing chapter 16, which I would call a kind of debriefing. This has been the second meeting between Tertius Lydgate and Rosamond Vincy, and what has been the result? Get ready for a certain sense of déjà vu. You will feel as though things being stated are things that have been stated before. At first, I was a little bored when I was reviewing pages 163 to 167 to get ready for this meditation. Eliot never completely deprives us of things to be curious about, so we're going to be fine. But I think the scene isn't entirely without purpose. Yes, the narrator repeats many things that we've heard before, but this is the second time that Tertius Lydgate has met Rosamond Vincy, and you'll remember that sort of significance, that high significance to that first very short meeting at Stone Court. Now, Lydgate did not fall head over heels in love instantly. He didn't behave impulsively the way he did in France, in Avignon. I think the narrator just wants us to understand that this second meeting, which was longer and included conversation and Rosamond's admirable musical performances, it still didn't unsettle Lydgate, didn't tip a balance, so to speak. We begin reading. But as it was not 11 o'clock, he chose to walk in the brisk air toward the tower of St. Botolph's, Mr. Fairbrother's church, which stood out dark, square, and massive against the starlight. It was the oldest church in Middlemarch. The living, however, was but a vicarage worth barely 400 a year. Lydgate had heard that, and he wondered now whether Mr. Fairbrother cared about the money he won at cards, thinking, he seems a very pleasant fellow, but Bulstrode may have his good reasons. Many things would be easier to Lydgate if it should turn out that Mr. Bulstrode was generally justifiable. What is his religious doctrine to me, if he carries some good notions with it? One must use such brains as are to be found. And right away, we have something we can look into here, this business of livings, where it says the living, however, at the Church of St. Botolph's was but a vicarage worth barely 400 a year. What is a living? Exactly. Now, this is peculiar to the Church of England, I believe, although anyone who understands other Christian denominations in detail and wants to speak up in the comments, please do. But a living was a kind of package deal where you got a job for life, a place to live in exchange for carrying out the spiritual and administrative duties for at least one parish church and its congregation. Now, who owned these livings? Who had the right to give them out to whomever they chose? My figures right now come from a website called Vicars, Curates, and Church Livings, and it's a page on the website of an historical author, Maria Grace, and the website's called Random Bits of Fascination, which I think is a cool title. You'll have a link in my description box. Of all the livings that were available in the early 19th century, about 5% were owned by the universities of Oxford and Cambridge combined. 10% were owned by the Crown. 20% were owned by bishops or cathedral chapters, and 60% were owned by gentry or aristocracy. For Mr. Fairbrother to have obtained one of these livings, however great or small it might be, the chances are good that he was either related to or very good friends with the owner of the living, because almost certainly the living at Middlemarch probably is owned by someone like Mr. Brooke or Sir James Chetham, at that sort of level, possibly Mr. Casaubon. We may find out exactly who Mr. Fairbrother owes his living to, so to speak. The narrator, their impression of the annual income was that it was a bit on the modest side, £400 per year. Lydgate seems to think the same. I don't know. He wonders whether Fairbrother's card-playing skills are necessary for him to earn a little extra money on the side. But as it happens, £400 a year was a little over the average for England at the time, and it could keep a careful man, someone who didn't spend too much money, at the level of sort of a lesser gentleman. And so for those familiar with Pride and Prejudice, I might mention too the parish of Husford, where Mr. Collins was living. Now that was a better off parish. The income that came in from rents and tithes was estimated at about £500 to £600 per year, so better. Everything depended upon the value of the tithes that were made by parishioners and the rents, if there were rentable properties on the land that was part of the living. We read on. These were actually Lidgett's first meditations as he walked away from Mr. Vincey's, and on this ground I fear that many ladies will consider him hardly worthy of their attention. He thought of Rosamond and her music only in the second place, and though when her turn came he dwelt on the image of her for the rest of his walk, he felt no agitation and had no sense that any new current had set into his life. He could not marry yet. He wished not to marry for several years, and therefore he was not ready to entertain the notion of being in love with a girl whom he happened to admire. He did admire Rosamond exceedingly, but that madness which had once beset him about lore was not, he thought, likely to recur in relation to any other woman. Certainly, if falling in love had been at all in question, it would have been quite safe with a creature like this Miss Vincey, who had just the kind of intelligence one would desire in a woman, polished, refined, docile, lending itself to finish in all the delicacies of life and enshrined in a body which expressed this with a force of demonstration that excluded the need for other evidence. Lidgett felt sure that if he ever married, his wife would have that feminine radiance, that distinctive womanhood which must be classed with flowers and music, that sort of beauty which by its very nature was virtuous, being moulded only for pure and delicate joys. And so there, as a debrief, there is a situation as Lidgett sees it. She's charming, is Rosamond. He sees in her everything he could possibly admire. He does think that, yes, were he to marry, what an ideal candidate Rosamond would be, but nothing emotional in him has changed. Not the way we saw him do in Paris, which was quite dramatic. We haven't seen that strange transformation where Lidgett becomes two different people. He is completely Dr. Lidgett, interested in his career. Yes, he will get married, but some years from now. That's where his mind stands. But since he did not mean to marry for the next 5 years, his more pressing business was to look into Louis's new book on fever, which he was specially interested in because he had known Louis in Paris and had followed many anatomical demonstrations in order to ascertain the specific differences of typhus and typhoid. He went home and read far into the smallest hour, bringing a much more testing vision of details and relations into this pathological study than he had ever thought it necessary to apply to the complexities of love and marriage, these being subjects on which he felt himself amply informed by literature and that traditional wisdom which is handed down in the genial conversation of men. Whereas fever had obscure conditions and gave him that delightful labor of the imagination, which is not mere arbitrariness, but the exercise of disciplined power, combining and constructing with the clearest eye for probabilities and the fullest obedience to knowledge, and then, in yet more energetic alliance with impartial nature, standing aloof to invent tests by which to try its own work. In the background to today's filming, I thought I should mention you may hear a chicken. We live very close to the town livestock market, and it seems that regularly people bring those very expensive breeds of poultry. On a semi-regular basis, we have had escapes, fugitive chickens who escape the market, and they come into our garden because it's the nearest route, and thank goodness it is, the nearest route they can take without crossing any roads. And the person who watches television feeds the wild birds, and so there's food here for them. And so we've acquired a chicken, which the person who watches television has told me he's named, and I am to call her Christabel. And so we do. So Christabel is outside right now, and I think she may have spotted a cat, and she's very good. She alerts all the other birds to the fact that there's a cat nearby, and she keeps on making this noise until the cat usually slinks away kind of sheepishly because it realizes that it's not going to have any fun with the wild birds today while Christabel is around, because she's also quite a large hen. So I've not yet seen a cat that's willing to take her on, consider her as prey. I think they consider her more like a watchdog. But let's talk about this Louis that Lidgett mentions. This book that he's reading would have been written by Pierre Charles Louis, who lived from 1787 to 1872. He was a French physician, and he accumulated more case notes, clinical notes about his patients than other physicians before him. And it gave him the evidence he needed to back up claims that bloodletting, using leeches applied to the skin to take blood from the human body, had limited effect on illnesses that were caused by inflammation, such as pneumonia. And there were British physicians who were at the time recording similar findings. And as a result of Louis' work and those in combination with those British physicians, bloodletting throughout the 19th century became a practice less and less used for a number of different illnesses. Middlemarch mentions that this book that Lidgett is reading is Louis' new book. Now, I don't know what the new means. I tried to look up on Google to see, okay, when exactly did Louis publish his works? And they don't have to be in translation. I imagine that Lidgett could read the original French, given the length of time he spent in Paris. But the earliest book I could find published by Louis was 1835, and I think that's a little late for this section of Middlemarch, unless it wasn't generally known at the time Eliot did her research that it was published in 1835. She perhaps was given a different date. I don't know. He also had some earlier articles printed in various journals around 1828, but again, nothing in book form. So I'm not sure what work this is meant to refer to. Perhaps she refers to his book, which was about fevers and the treatment of illnesses that were where inflammation in the body was involved. But one thing is sure, Lidgett, after the reading is done, he recognizes within himself once again just how complex a subject medicine is. There's no end of obscurities, and if you wanted to understand it, you had to really apply yourself. You had to discipline yourself to record and to remember all these different observations that other people had set down for you. Conversely, he feels that love and marriage, matters like that, you hardly need to trouble yourself. You can easily learn everything you need to know from literature, or, and I love this quote, from traditional wisdom handed down in the genial conversations of men. I'm trying to let myself not laugh. Don't laugh, but it's funny. You might want to. We've all heard about, witnessed, or participated in those kind of genial conversations about women. They don't contain necessarily a lot of accuracies, but never mind. But it's important also to note, Lidgett doesn't believe that a relationship with a woman demands that he bring his full powers of intellect. He thinks he can wing it because, he thinks it's as easy as reading a romance novel or enjoying some banter with the boys. And Eliot's narrator specifically uses wording that suggests Lidgett doesn't think his imagination is needed to negotiate a relationship. You know, that delightful labor of imagination that he knows he must bring to his academic discipline, he doesn't think he really needs in connection with women, because he doesn't see that women themselves are capable of that kind of power of imagination. We read on. Many men have been praised as vividly imaginative on the strength of their profuseness in indifferent drawing or cheap narration, reports of very poor talk going on in distant orbs, or portraits of Lucifer coming down on his bad errands as a large, ugly man with bat wings and spurts of phosphorescence, or exaggerations of wantonness that seem to reflect life in a diseased dream. But these kinds of inspiration Lidgett regarded as rather vulgar and vinous, compared with the imagination that reveals subtle actions inaccessible by any sort of lens, but tracked in that outer darkness through long pathways of necessary sequence by the inward light which is the last refinement of energy, capable of bathing even the ethereal atoms in its ideally illuminated space. He, for his part, had tossed away all cheap inventions, where ignorance finds itself able and at ease. He was enamored of that arduous invention, which is the very eye of research, provisionally framing its object and correcting it to more and more exactness of relation. He wanted to pierce the obscurity of those minute processes which prepare human misery and joy, those invisible thoroughfares which are the first lurking places of anguish, mania, and crime, that delicate poise and transition which determine the growth of happy or unhappy consciousness. It is lovely to see in this section the passion Lidgett has for getting down to the ultimate details about the human body, which could let him know the secrets of where does illness and unhappiness and all woes begin. Where, if we understand exactly the mechanics of this great device, this human, then we can get to once we get to the roots of things, we can solve problems. And I must admit, I did get excited reading the top of that page. I thought he's so passionate. And when it happens to be about his profession, it's difficult not to admire him and think, yeah, you go, Tertius. I hope you discover something. I hope you make a real breakthrough, because this is the century when many of the medical advances that we now take for granted, this is where they were discovered, and these were the kind of men who discovered them. Regarding that paragraph on page 164, near the bottom, which I outlined, and what did I highlight? Indifferent drawing or cheap narration. I was very much trying to figure out what specifically is Eliot's narrator referring to. She's always so specific in what she's alluding to. And she's obviously having a dig at something here. She's obviously picking out examples either of indifferent drawing, which could mean cartoons. Certainly there was the growth of the editorial cartoon. It had existed in the 18th century, but there were more publications in which it could appear, so there were more cartoonists plying their trade. And also, when she talks about cheap narration, well, we know the 19th century allowed for the publication of a lot of books and magazines, periodicals which contained fiction in them, and they varied in their quantity, and they varied in terms of the kind of audience they hoped to reach. There was certainly a very big audience, a growing audience of literate middle-class and working-class people. And as they became literate, of course, they became a market for reading, and reading was the entertainment of the time. It was the thing to get involved in. You know, I suppose if you wanted to compare it to social media, you could say it was like when TikTok came out. Everybody goes for that. Reading was the thing. You wanted to be reading. You wanted to be keeping up with these periodicals if you could. If you couldn't afford it, you tried to hear somebody else. You tried to pick up somebody else's copy. You got what you could, but you knew it was the thing to be into. It was the way of passing the time. But I honestly don't know what she was describing here in terms of the reports of very poor talk going on in distant orbs. That sounds like science fiction. We're a little early in time for the emergence of science fiction. There were some 19th century books which described civilizations on other worlds. Wikipedia's article on science fiction mentions a couple of titles, and it was good to know, but I'm not going to mention them. I will put the link to the Wikipedia page, because honestly, I don't know if Eliot's narrator is talking about any of them. And definitely I couldn't find any reference to Lucifer coming down on his bad errands as a large man with bat's wings and etc., spurts of phosphorescence. I like the description. It made me smile. Because we need some kind of rabbit hole discussion, I will throw out two wild guesses as to what she might be referring to. One, in 1772, there was a novel titled Le Diable Amoureux, which was published in France by Jacques Cazot. He had a number of fantastical stories in print, and he also translated a number of the Arabian Nights stories into French. Now, Eliot was fluent in French, so she might have read Cazot's book, or perhaps started it, found it awful, and saved up all her ire for this little paragraph in Middlemarch. In The Mill on the Floss, my second wild guess, The Mill on the Floss, little girl Maggie Tulliver shows off her reading, shows off how much she's read to a visitor who comes to her father's house. And it turns out she's very familiar with The History of the Devil by Daniel Defoe. And I don't know if Eliot would have considered Defoe's writing cheap. I don't think she would have. So I'm not sure if that's a good guess. Cazot's book, maybe, but I honestly don't know. She could be referring to a painting, for all I know, that's kind of obscure, a drawing that she saw in the newspaper. I have no idea. We read on. As he threw down his book, stretched his legs towards the embers in the grate, and clasped his hands at the back of his head, in that agreeable afterglow of excitement when thought lapses from examination of a specific object into a suffusive sense of its connections with all the rest of our existence, seems as it were to throw itself on its back after vigorous swimming and float with the repose of unexhausted strength. Lidgett felt a triumphant delight in his studies and something like pity for those less lucky men who were not of his profession. If I had not taken that turn when I was a lad, he thought, I might have got into some stupid draft horse work or other and lived always in blinkers. I should never have been happy in any profession that did not call forth the highest intellectual strain, and yet keep me in good, warm contact with my neighbours. There is nothing like the medical profession for that. One can have the exclusive scientific life that touches the distance and befriend the old fogies in the parish too. It is rather harder for a clergyman. Fairbrother seems to be an anomaly. You'll see that I've underlined there the quote from Lidgett, his thoughts. He felt a triumphant delight in his studies and something like pity for those less lucky men who were not of his profession. And I had to write, pride preceding the fall, because that is what immediately came to mind. I thought, you're so satisfied with yourself. It reminded me too of the very first scene and act in Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, which is somewhat similar, although Faustus is spending more time. Yes, he's telling you that he pretty much knows everything there is to know about everything, so there is a pride in that, but he's also frustrated because there's knowledge he knows he hasn't got, that nobody has, and of course that's the reason that he summons up Mephistopheles and asks to sell his soul in exchange for the access to all this great knowledge and power. But that's getting off the point. I don't see Lidgett really quite as a Faustus exactly, but certainly a man a little bit too satisfied with himself. And in all fables and stories, this precedes some kind of fall. Draft horse work. Just in case anyone isn't sure what that means. I grew up with relatives who had farms, so I was familiar with it. And a lot of you in North America may have had ancestors who were farming or ranching. A draft horse is, of course, a heavy breed of horse, usually used to pull farm machinery before there were tractors, vehicles to do that. And they often wore, as part of their assemblage, the bridle and harness had blinkers. And the blinkers were to keep them from being distracted from things on either side of them, including if they were yoked together with another horse, if they worked in a pair, to keep them from being distracted by each other, apparently. Okay, enough equestrianism. Now we go on and continue reading. This last thought brought back the Vinceys and all the pictures of the evening. They floated in his mind agreeably enough, and as he took up his bed candle, his lips were curled with that incipient smile which is apt to accompany agreeable recollections. He was an ardent fellow, but at present his ardour was absorbed in love of his work and in the ambition of making his life recognized as a factor in the better life of mankind, like other heroes of science who had nothing but an obscure country practice to begin with. So here we see a repetition of something that has been mentioned in an earlier chapter. Lidgett with this little goal to be a good country doctor and this big goal to do something that benefits mankind as a whole. Right now, all his ardor, all his passion, all his energy is focused on that, and he does not feel the least bit changed by his second meeting with Rosamond. Now we get to know Rosamond's reaction, which is very different. Poor Lidgett, or shall I say, poor Rosamond. Each lived in a world of which the other knew nothing. It had not occurred to Lidgett that he had been a subject of eager meditation to Rosamond, who had neither any reason for throwing her marriage into distant perspective, nor any pathological studies to divert her mind from that ruminating habit, that inward repetition of looks, words, and phrases which makes a large part of the lives of most girls. He had not meant to look at her or speak to her with more than the inevitable amount of admiration and compliment which a man must give to a beautiful girl. Indeed, it seemed to him that his enjoyment of her music had remained almost silent, for he feared falling into the rudeness of telling her his great surprise at her possession of such accomplishment. But Rosamond had registered every look and word and estimated them as the opening incidents of a preconceived romance, incidents which gather value from the foreseen development and climax. In Rosamond's romance, it was not necessary to imagine much about the inward life of the hero or of his serious business in the world. Of course, he had a profession and was clever as well as sufficiently handsome, but the piquant fact about Lidgett was his good birth, which distinguished him from all Middlemarch admirers and presented marriage as a prospect of rising in rank and getting a little nearer to that celestial condition on earth in which she would have nothing to do with vulgar people, and perhaps at last associate with relatives quite equal to the country people who looked down on the Middlemarchers. It was part of Rosamond's cleverness to discern very subtly the faintest aroma of rank, and once, when she had seen the Miss Brookes accompanying their uncle at the country assizes and seated among the aristocracy, she had envied them, notwithstanding their plain dress. It's such a powerful paragraph, even though we are probably not surprised by anything that it says. Eliot's narrator is saying everything that happened in that second meeting for Rosamond was like an inventory, a build-up toward a romance she's already written in her mind, and she can already see where it's going, and now all she's doing is filling in the details as they happen. But she knows what these details will lead to. She already has the story structure in place. It's just up to Lidgett now. Everything he says and does is already being fitted on this timeline of events, so to speak, which is going to lead to their marriage, apparently. And Rosamond, Eliot's narrator makes this clear, Rosamond has nothing else to do. Rosamond has nothing else to put her energy into. And she has her own kind of cleverness. And what that could have been if she had been allowed to study something more academic, I don't know. We just can't estimate that, because all she's given access to is this incredible fixation on how to appear like an upper-class lady and to have all the habits of one in order to attract a very good husband. This is her only skill, her only discipline, her only life's work. And so, of course, she, much like Lidgett, is putting all her energy and passion into it. And it's just unfortunate. These two are working in completely opposite directions from each other. And perhaps for the first time, we see Rosamond's ambition clearly delineated. She needs to move up in socioeconomic class. She aims for the aristocracy. She wants to be on the level of Dorothea and Celia Brooke. She wants to be able to meet them as an equal. And she envies them. The word is plain and simple. There isn't any flowery language to disguise her real feelings. She envies them. She wants to be them. We read on. If you think it incredible that to imagine Lidgett as a man of family could cause thrills of satisfaction which had anything to do with the sense that she was in love with him, I will ask you to use your power of comparison a little more effectively and consider whether red cloth and epaulettes have never had an influence of that sort. Our passions do not live apart in locked chambers, but dressed in their small wardrobe of notions, bring their provisions to a common table and mess together, feeding out of the common store according to their appetite. I think that paragraph needs explaining. It's basically saying to us, the reading audience, look, if you think it's strange that Rosamond can base her whole need to have Lidgett as a husband on his socioeconomic status and can believe that she loves him on that basis alone, it says, well, just a second, aren't there other points of comparison? And then, of course, it talks about whether red cloth and epaulettes have never had an influence of that sort. And it's referring to British military uniform, which would have been red in colour, and epaulettes are those wonderful things with tassels that fit on the shoulders. And of course, you can put stripes on them and, all those signs and notions. Eliot's narrator uses the word notions. Our passions do not live apart in locked chambers, but dressed in their small wardrobe of notions. That is, our passions are triggered. Our ability to be attracted to another person is triggered by a lot of societal expectations, which are a little bag of notions and if those notions are met, we can sometimes believe that we love someone. And I think this is just setting up one of those romance situations where it's the appearance of the person. It ticks all the boxes in someone's imaginary list, and therefore shouldn't be any problem, should it? The relationship should just run fine. And it's an interesting setup because, of course, there's so much scope now for disappointment, since the basis for love is so much of the surface of the person and not their inner self, which Eliot's narrator says clearly Rosamond has no idea. We read on. Rosamond, in fact, was entirely occupied, not exactly with Tertius Lidgett as he was in himself, but with his relation to her, and it was excusable in a girl who was accustomed to hear that all young men might, could, would be, or actually were in love with her, to believe at once that Lidgett could be no exception. His looks and words meant more to her than other men's because she cared more for them. She thought of them diligently and diligently attended to that perfection of appearance, behaviour, sentiments, and all other elegancies, which would find in Lidgett a more adequate admirer than she had yet been conscious of. For Rosamond, though she would never do anything that was disagreeable to her, was industrious, and now more than ever she was active in sketching her landscapes and market carts and portraits of friends, in practicing her music, and in being from morning till night her own standard of a perfect lady, having always an audience in her own consciousness, with sometimes the not unwelcome addition of a more variable external audience in the numerous visitors of the house. She found time also to read the best novels, and even the second best, and she knew much poetry by heart. Her favourite poem was Lalla Rhookh. The best girl in the world, he will be a happy fellow who gets her, was the sentiment of the elderly gentleman who visited the Vincys, and the rejected young men thought of trying again, as is the fashion in country towns where the horizon is not thick with coming rivals. But Mrs. Plymdale thought that Rosamond had been educated to a ridiculous pitch, for what was the use of accomplishments which would all be laid aside as soon as she was married? While her Aunt Bulstrode, who had a sisterly faithfulness towards her brother's family, had two sincere wishes for Rosamond, that she might show a more serious turn of mind, and that she might meet with a husband whose wealth corresponded to her habits. little bit of unpacking. Lalla Rhookh. Lalla Rhookh was one of those exotic romantic poems in the early 19th century. They were written to sound like folk tales. They sometimes had a basis in actual folk tales, but they didn't have to. Some of them were pure inventions. There was a fashion, a craze, an enthusiasm for these in the first 20 years of the 19th century. And I don't have the right poetic taste buds for this kind of verse. I'll just admit that right now. The settings that are described by words like limpid and fairy bowers and that has trembling maidens in peril. Do you get the idea? If you like that kind of thing, there's a link in my description box to the Poetry Foundation website, and you can read to your heart's content. I did, but I came away feeling a little queasy myself, just my taste. We end, therefore, with this strange situation of Lidgett throwing all his passion and energy and intellect into one thing, and Rosamond throwing all her passion and intellect and energy into something completely different. And their minds are in completely different places in terms of how they see the next few years progressing. Wow. We're going to have to follow them. I am very interested. One question I did have, though, at the end of this chapter, the final paragraph suddenly mentions Mrs. Plymdale. And I thought, well, who is this? Who is this Mrs. Plymdale? And, the way her name is mentioned suggests that we should have encountered her before, read about her before. And I thought, is it me? Is it me? So I have a Kindle version of Middlemarch as well. It's just for this purpose, to search. Kindle ebooks, the wonderful thing about them is you can use their search parameters and find out what you're not sure you remember correctly. And I do remember this correctly. Mrs. Plymdale has never been mentioned up till now. The surname Plymdale has. And let's talk about the two mentions of that. On page 100, chapter 11, the name Plymdale was mentioned. Fred Vincey went to the house and had dinner there. That's it. No mention of the actual individuals in the family. And then page 130, chapter 13, where Mr. Vincey meets Mr. Bulstrode. You remember Mr. Vincey got angry with Bulstrode, and to kind of threaten him into doing what he wanted, he talked about how he knew that the Plymdales were using green and blue dyes on their fabric that rotted the silk. And evidently then there's some kind of alliance between Bulstrode and the Plymdales. And Vincey was obviously saying, I could really undo that if I wanted to, if I just let out a little bit of knowledge and made certain facts public. So that's the second time. But again, it's just mentioned as Plymdales. So we know it's a family. We don't know how large it is. Nothing. Now all of a sudden we get this individual, Mrs. Plymdale. So I was right. We've never heard of her before. And you know what? It's funny because we're not going to meet Mrs. Plymdale anytime soon. In 2 chapters' time, we'll meet Mr. Plymdale. Great. But we're not going to lay eyes on Mrs. Plymdale until chapter 31. We're on chapter 16 now. At the rate that we go through Middlemarch, which is slow, deliberately slow, intentionally slow, it's probably going to be next year by the time we meet this woman. Well, there we go. Hopefully I'll remember that I mentioned her here. And that's it, guys. It's a very short meditation because I felt it was a very straightforward ending to the chapter. Now we're going to meet some new characters in chapter 17. Looking forward to that. In the meantime, everybody, great reading. I'm going to record a whole lot of videos today because I have this place to myself. Brilliant. So I'm just going to get right on to that. You take care of yourself, whatever you're doing. I'll see you again in a few days' time. Take care. Bye-bye.